Wonderful. So, we are second week into our series in Lent, and you've got some little boxes, and in those boxes are some slips of paper. You will need those as we go through this morning. Particularly if you're a child and you haven't got one, just raise a flag, and I'm sure a kind adult would love to make sure you have got one. Otherwise, do grab them as we go through. But we're looking at different stories in the Bible about 40 days. Typically, we think of Jesus going into the desert and being tempted for 40 days. But actually, all the way through the Bible, there's loads of other stories with this idea of 40. 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years. And they all sort of signify this time of waiting, or this time of struggling, this time of holding fast, after which God does something new. So this morning, we're looking at the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years. Can you imagine what that would have been like? 40 years. So, first question for you this morning. What is your favorite thing ever to eat? Just shout it out. Your favorite thing ever to eat?
Pizza.
Pizza. Lasagna. Halloumi.
Wow. Quail's
Steak.
eggs.
Boiled eggs.
Quail's eggs.
Quail's eggs. Carrot cake.
They are delicious.
Any chocolate? Any bacon butties? Okay, very good. Now imagine if every morning, that's enough. If every morning you could get out of bed, you could go downstairs, unless you're in a bungalow, you could open your front door, you could walk out into the street, and there in front of you, all across the road, was your favorite food, and you could eat as much of it as you wanted. How good would that be? Well, as we look at our Bible passage this morning, that's what we see happened for the Israelites. We see God providing food for his people, the Israelites, every single day. Now, I'm not really a good cook at all. My problem is I try and make it up. I see a recipe and I think that's a bit standard. And so what I'll try and do is add a bit of spice here or another flavor there or just a completely random ingredient there just because I don't know why. Probably need therapy, but there we go. That's why. The point is, if you came round for dinner and you tasted my food, you would probably ask, what is that? What is it? And if you spoke in Hebrew, which I don't think many of you do, which is the language that Moses and the Israelites spoke, you wouldn't say, what is it? But the Hebrew equivalent would be to say, manna. Because manna simply means, what is it? What is it? And manna, of course, was the name of the food that God miraculously provided for his people each morning when they were in the desert. It didn't make sense. It wasn't a food stuff they'd seen before, and yet God provided miraculously for them. And so they said, what is it? What is it? So my first question this morning is, what is it that God provides for you? What is it that God provides for you? And like I say, you've got 3 slips of paper in your box. I want you to imagine your boxes are like baskets, kind of gathering up the manna. But could you write down 1 or 2 things, or if you don't want to write, just call to mind 1 or 2 things. What is it that God provides for you? What is it that God provides for you? Just draw a picture or jot a few things down. And then I want you to put them in your box. Gather them up. What is it that God has provided for you? The piece of paper isn't big enough to list everything, but just 2 or 3 things that you're really thankful for, that you recognize that God provides for you. Now, that's a really simple question in one way. There's loads of ways you could answer it, but the truth is that often when God provides stuff for us, we don't often recognize it, and we take so much of it for granted. In fact, often, I wonder if all of us are a bit like the Israelites. You see, God had done so much for them. He'd freed them from slavery. He'd led them across the sea that had parted. He'd looked after them. He provided for them. And yet, they grumbled and they complained. God had given them so much, and yet very quickly they took for granted what he had done. And rather than being thankful, rather than trusting him for all their needs, instead they grumbled and complained and focused on what they hadn't got. And I wonder sometimes if we can be a bit like that. Do we sometimes focus more on what we haven't got than what we have? You see, God has promised to meet our needs, not necessarily our expectations. And so when God provides, we often don't recognize it because we're busy looking for the things he hasn't done that we wanted him to do. And the Israelites just needed to see where God had brought them from and where he was taking them to. But they lost sight of that, apart from Moses. And instead, they focused solely on the present. One of the verses I love in the Bible is from Philippians 4, and it says this: "Don't worry, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And then the peace of God, which goes beyond all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." And the truth is, I often read that verse is, don't worry about everything, pray to God, and he'll give you his peace. But pray about everything with thanksgiving. You see, there's something about when we're thankful, when we're grateful, when we recognize everything God has done for us, that releases, these verses say, a peace that goes beyond all understanding. So that's my first question. What is it that God provides for you? And maybe during this period of Lent, as we work up to Easter, every day, you might get that thing out of your box, or you might start the day before you do anything, thanking God for something he's provided you with. My second question is, in what ways are you sharing the things that God provides you with? In what ways are you sharing the things that God provides you with? This is a bit more tricky to answer, but you might just want to write that down. So it might be kind of things you own, or money, or your home. What ways are you sharing those with people? It might be some of the gifts God's given you. You might be someone who's really encouraging and kind, and you might use those to help other people. Lots of ways that God has given us things. How are you sharing those things with others? You see, the passage tells us people would have gathered up manna by day and quail in the evening. These were then cooked, made into meals, and they'd have been shared amongst the families and the groups and the tribes. It wasn't a case of every man for himself, suddenly dive bombing, gathering up all the manna and not letting anyone else near it because they were afraid that they wouldn't have enough. They would have gathered it, cooked it, and eaten and shared it in community. Now we read that some, in fact, were tempted to hoard all they could, to make sure they had more than enough for themselves, so that they were okay, that they wouldn't run out, never mind everyone else. And do you know what happened to that food that they gathered that they didn't need? The passage tells us when it got to night, it rotted. Loads of worms came and ate it up. God only allowed them to have what they needed and what they would share with others. You see, God wanted them to trust him that there would be plenty for everyone each day. And if we trust God to meet our needs, that frees us to share our stuff. That frees us to share our time. That frees us to be generous people, because we recognize none of it is God's anyway. Sorry, all of it is God's. Just checking if you're listening. Well done, James. You're first to notice. None of it is ours anyway. It all comes from God. Let me say that one more time just to make sure. None of it is ours anyway. It all comes from God. Now, there was a story that Ben reminded me of a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi called Chaim of Romishok. And he had this picture called Long Spoons. So I'm just going to get a couple of people here who don't mind. You can't have a gluten allergy, I'm afraid. Joel, thank you. Do you want to stand over there? Please, we're going to have a bit of a race. Harry, do you want to come up? Do you want to come and stand over here? Okay, you go that side of the lectern. Oh, good catch. Joel, you come in here. Okay, it's going to be a race. Okay, you need to feed yourself a bit of croissant, but you're only allowed to hold the stick at the bottom. Okay, so you can put two hands on like that, right to the bottom. Right to the bottom. Okay, the winner is the first person to feed themselves. Off you go. No, because you've still got to eat it off the fork. And now it's covered in bacteria. Okay, has anybody got any ideas how they can feed themselves? Let's go to a child. Thank you, Andy. There we go.
Feed each other.
Feed each other. Do you want to feed each other? Offer this to Harry. You don't have to eat it. I know it's been on the floor. Just imagine. It's theatre. That's okay, that one. You can have a nibble. There we go. You have a nibble. You have a nibble. Just pretend. There we go. Thank you very much. Go and sit down. Thank you. Mental note not to ask Harry to come and help with illustrations. Thank you, Harry. But you see the point. You see the point that God gives us enough so that we can share with others. There's more than 1.5 enough food in the world for everyone to have enough. We've got enough for everyone, and then half again, and yet 682 million people live in extreme poverty. If you look in Numbers 11, which is one of the places where the Israelites complain and they ask for even more meat for themselves. In Hebrew, it's called Kibrith Hatva. And in Hebrew, that name means graves of craving or graves of greed. And one commentator wrote this: all of us would personally love to experience a miracle of God in our lives. The problem is, most of us don't want to be in a position where we ever need one. Or to put it another way, are we more concerned with the condition of our stomachs than of our souls? So the second question is, how are you sharing what God provides you with? So you should now have two things in your boxes, and we're going to ask a final and third question. Who has God provided for you that meets all our needs? Who has God provided for us that meets all our needs? For once, it is the typical Sunday school question. Write Jesus on your piece of paper. I'm sure the other people you wrote are brilliant too. But that's only because Jesus has given them so they can share with others. Point two. So perhaps the biggest lesson through this story of 40 years isn't just that God provided manna, but that actually this story points us to Jesus. God met the Israelites in the wilderness by giving them manna, which they made into bread and satisfied them for a day. But then they were hungry again. God will meet us in the desert, will meet us in the wilderness by providing us with Jesus. And Jesus says in John, I am the bread of life. No one who comes to me will ever be hungry, and no one who believes in me will ever be thirsty again. This passage points us to Jesus. Jesus, the only one who can fill us, the only one who can satisfy, the only one who can prevent death. And he says to us, we're to feast every day, not on manna, but on Jesus. It's the difference between just pouring in enough and saying that's all you need for today, to pouring so it overflows. And Jesus said, I have come that you would have life and have it in all its fullness. And so as we go through Lent, you might want to use those boxes each day. We're going to pray with them in a few moments' time. But each day, as we come up to Easter, how can you feast more on the bread of life? How can you read his word more? How can you start your day being thankful to him? What if this Lent, every single day, we started the day by feasting on Jesus and knowing he will meet our needs for the day? How might you change? How might your school change? How might your places of work change? How might this city change? I am the bread of life. No one who comes to me will ever be hungry. So we're going to stand together and we're just going to come. We're going to ask Jesus just to come and fill us again.